Good day, good day. We are now in day 16 of our Bible reading, where we've read from Genesis chapter 46 and 47. I'll be giving a few lessons, and I'll start with a quick summary of these two chapters. We see in chapter 46 that Jacob or Israel is going to make this journey into Egypt. He's moving with his family to Egypt, where there is grain, where there is food, because the land of Canaan, there is famine. In fact, this famine has hit a very wide area, but now Joseph is alive, and this is something that Jacob had finally realized and learned in the previous chapter. He had believed that his son Joseph was alive, and therefore he's making the journey to move from the land of his father. And this is probably a very scary of journey to take, because he's in his comfort zone, he's in the land of his fathers, and now he's moving to another land. Remember that Jacob did not have it easy. In fact, we're going to learn in chapter 47 how he speaks to Pharaoh, saying that his life has been a little bit challenging, and perhaps it might also point to this, that he's been moving about. He spent some time growing up in the land of his fathers, but went to Laban, and he spent some time with Laban. As we saw, he spent so many years, 20 odd years, where he was working for Laban, and that goes to show that his journey has been a challenging journey, and now he's about to move. And therefore, even in this move, maybe he might be taking it with a little bit of fear, given that he's moving away from the land of his fathers, the land of Abraham, the land of Isaac, the land that God has promised to give Jacob. Imagine moving away from the place where you've been promised to receive as an inheritance, that this land belongs to your descendants and it shall be for you forever. And it's a covenant that God has established with Abraham and Isaac. And here we see Jacob moving away from this land, and therefore we can understand the fear that might be in his heart, or the anxiety that might be in his heart. In fact, I'm going to give a lesson about what God does in this very moment, because we see God goes and speak to Jacob, even in the midst of him, perhaps wrestling in his heart and making this journey to Egypt. Now, in this chapter, we're also going to see the descendants of Jacob. They're being mentioned so that we have an idea how many people are going down to Egypt with Jacob. And he says that 66 were his direct descendants, meaning these are his sons, a few daughters mentioned as well as his grandsons, right? And what we also see is that in total it was 66 of his own descendants, but in total they went as 70 people where they went down to Egypt. What we also see in this chapter is Jacob finally reunites with Joseph, his son. There's an embracing that takes place. They love one another. We can see this emotional thing of he thought his son was dead. So this is like a resurrection if you think about it, because he's not seen his son in this long time, and he thought that his son was dead. And finally, Joseph plans that they should stay in the land of Goshen, and this is where he tells his brothers and Jacob, his father, that they should say to Pharaoh that they are shepherds, and in that way they'll be allocated the land of Goshen. I'll say a little bit about that as well. Then in chapter 47, we do see now Jacob does eventually meet up with Pharaoh. He blesses Pharaoh. Joseph does go to speak to Pharaoh initially to tell him that his family is here, and there's a blessing taking place. They do settle in the land of Goshen. We also read about the fact that the famine was so bad. And here we get a glimpse of how some of the slavery or servitude, the servants of the times of old, what led to their condition of being slaves. This is one of the conditions. Because when the Bible speaks of slavery or being a servant, it's not necessarily speaking about the slavery which we got to know in the great slave trade in the few years ago, but actually it was a different context and a different type of slavery. And this is something one should appreciate when they read the word slave or they read the word servant, that it doesn't necessarily mean the word slave or servant in the modern day. It had its own originating factors. And what we read in chapter 47, we see a bit of that. We see how indeed the people are surrendering to Pharaoh and to Joseph to say, we are your people, we are your servants, because of the extreme poverty, or the extreme rather famine that they were in, which is a form of poverty as well. They did not have food anymore, and therefore they were selling all their possessions and even their land. We see how the land of priests has been spared. What is quite interesting to observe is that Goshen was technically spared. It's as if Jacob's family were in Egypt, but unlike the rest of the Egyptians. So this is quite something there to also observe the blessing that was over this family. And the last thing that we see is we are seeing the days of Jacob, how many years he ended up living, the fact that he was alive in Egypt for 17 years. That's a long period of time. And when you read these stories, everything appears like it happened so quickly, but actually these things did in fact take long. Because you read it, it's condensed and it looks like it all happened in few months, but actually 17 years. When he was in Laban's house, that was 20 years. Remember, he served 7 years for Rachel, then another 7 because he got given Leah instead. So that is already 14 years. Then he served again just to serve this man, and he finally left. So all of these years, they seem, when you read it, seems like it's short, but it's actually a long period of time of him being away from his own land. And then we see how he asks Joseph, he speaks to Joseph, and he asks him to promise that he will not bury him in Egypt, but he will bury him in the land of his fathers, the land where Abraham and Isaac were buried. So I think there's something interesting to observe, and I'll speak a little bit about that as well. All right, now let's get into my few lessons quickly, starting with chapter 46. I've highlighted verse 2, which says, "And God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am." So the context that we are seeing here is that Jacob is now having to make this journey. It starts in verse 1 saying, "So Israel took his journey with all that he had," right? "And he came to Beersheba." So he offered sacrifices. So we see that he's seeking God, is offering sacrifices. He's making this journey because he now wants to journey into Egypt. And we are seeing here God saying in verse 3, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt." And as we see what's going on here, it's almost clear that perhaps Jacob was afraid to go down to Egypt, and that's why God's saying, "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for they'll make you a great nation," right? But verse 12 highlighted because it says, "And God spoke to Israel in vision, and he said, Jacob, Jacob." So I paused. I'm like, God, were you not the one a few chapters ago who said to Jacob, "Jacob, your name shall not be Jacob anymore. Your name shall be Israel"? Why is it that you said that his name shall now be Israel? You gave him a new name, but now you're calling him Jacob, Jacob. So God is speaking to Israel, but he calls him with his former name. He calls him with his birth name, Jacob, Jacob. And there's just interesting things we can mention about this. The fact that God is speaking to this man, perhaps in his fear point, perhaps in his weak point, perhaps in the fact that there's famine, there's a bit of trouble going on. He's moving not just cities, but he's moving the land which was promised to him. This is the land that he's to possess this land. It was given to his father Isaac, to his father Abraham. This is the land, this is the covenant land, and he's moving away from this covenant land. And yet, so you can almost imagine what is going on in his heart as he's moving away from the covenant land, the land that is being promised to him, to his descendants. And yet, God says, Jacob, Jacob. So we have Israel, we have Jacob, it's one person. Israel is his new name, Jacob is his birth name. And I just like to observe that God, as he speaks to this man who's in this emotional state, he takes it back to being more personal. He takes it back to the birth name. He takes it back to the birth name. So I want to mention 2 points about God saying Jacob, Jacob. The first point is to realize Israel is a covenant name. It's a name attached to these covenant blessings. It's a name attached to him being a people, to being him a father of the nation, the nation of Israel, him being the father of the 12 tribes even, right? So Israel is a name which is linked to this great nation that he's a people. So it's not just him. It's almost like it's an office. It's almost like it's a title, if you can even think of it that way. It's as if it points to him being a father to the 12, to the nation that is a people, is a great nation. In fact, one can say that it points to him in an official sense, but not in a personal sense. And here God is going back to the personal sense to say that Jacob, Jacob. So I want to say in my first point, God knows him by name and he calls him by his birth name. So he's a God who's a personal God. He's a God who knows personal situations. He's a God who addresses the person. He's not just the God of the big things where he's going to address the big things. You're going to be a big nation. You're going to be a great people. But he also addresses the individual. Right? And as I think about it, even for our context, is that we can be engaged in mission. We can be in mission, maybe planting churches. You're missionaries. You're going big for God. You're observing the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations, Matthew 28. And as you're observing all of this great mission and you want to do every sort of work for the Lord, and in that level, you're working for God's mission. It's not your mission, it's God's mission. You're working for God's agenda. It's as if you're more interested in saying your kingdom come. It's about his vision, it's about his agenda and not about yours. But I want to say to someone that even in that, God does know us by name. God does call us by name. God does know our birth name. He is a personal God. He's not just a God who says that, yeah, let's take care of the big stuff. And yes, he's all about the big stuff, but yet he cares even for the person. He cares even for coming to the personal level. He's a God who's a personal God. A personal God. Jacob, Jacob. He knows us by name. He's calling Jacob by name. And it's quite interesting that this same Jacob, God will say that I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He doesn't say the God of Israel. So he mentions the name which is personal to Jacob, the one he was in his birth. He had it from his birth. In fact, another second lesson we can mention here is the realization that Israel points to this transformed man. Israel points to this man who is now in a newer version, new person. You can almost like say that Israel is Jacob 2.0, is the born again Jacob, if you want to say that in a manner of speaking, right? Is the new version, if we can put it in that way. It's not exact. I'm just trying to drive a lesson here to say that Israel is this new thing about Israel in terms of what Israel represents, and Jacob represents the old man, the man who was scheming. Remember, he was scheming. The man who was doing all sorts of things, and yet he has this new name. It's as if there's this new beginning which took place. He had an opportunity to begin anew, but God is not afraid to call him by the name Jacob, even no matter what Jacob is associated with. So I want to say to someone that God is not afraid of our past. God can embrace us with our past. God can speak to us with our past. He's not afraid of our past. He knows that you are a new creation, but you do have a past, and he's not afraid of that past. He receives you as his own. He says that come. You are his child, even if you have a past which might not be good. God is not afraid of our past. I love verse 4. I've highlighted verse 4. I myself will go down with you. So there's this thing I've been seeing over and over again, which God speaks over Jacob, saying, I will go with you. I will be with you. We saw it when God told Jacob to leave Laban, and he said, "I'll be with you." I myself, himself, God himself will be with him. So what a wonderful promise to say that, God. What does Egypt represent? Egypt represent the land outside the promised land. So even as people are on the outside, as they're going through whatever they're going through, whatever challenges they're going through, Egypt is a place where he's going because of the famine in the land where he's in right now. And God says, "I'll be with you. I'll be with you. Not only that, I'll bring you up again." So he'll bring him up again. And this is a word that God spoke. He says, "I will bring you up again." And let's note this, because there's something that is mentioned in the book of Hebrews that says that Jacob had faith because he believed God. He believed God that this land of Canaan is his possession. And that is mentioned in the book of Hebrews when it mentions the men of faith, the men and women of faith. All right? So, two more verses I've highlighted in chapter 46. Verse 31 says, Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I'll go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were in the land of Canaan have come to me." Now, the reason I highlight this is to realize that Joseph was given authority, all authority, by Pharaoh. Pharaoh, if we remember what happened back, he just gave him so much power and authority to operate here in Egypt. And one could almost assume that by that authority, Joseph could have actually given his household, his family, the land, allocated them the land. He could have done whatever he wanted to do without even speaking to Pharaoh, but yet it does. And for me, this speaks of honor. It's such a wonderful thing. And also, I know in the past I've been saying a lot about Joseph being a type of Christ. And we do see how even with Christ, he's one with God. We believe that Jesus is God, the Father is God, the Holy Spirit is God. And yet, there seems to be this thing that Jesus yields to the Father. There's that sense of Jesus says, I submit to the Father. I do what my Father tells me to do, which of course is something which makes some people wonder, wait, is Jesus lesser or not? But what we're seeing here, and I really don't want to drive the topic on Joseph being a type anymore. I think I've done enough of that. But it's just a wonderful observation that Joseph still speaks to Pharaoh. He still honors Pharaoh. He had so much authority, but he's still interested in mentioning to Pharaoh that his family is here. He doesn't just exercise the authority and power that he's been given by Pharaoh to say that, no, you can do, I'm giving you this land, you can stay here. And as we read here, we see how he tells his family that they must say that they are shepherds so that they can be separated out from the Egyptians, because the shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. It's quite interesting that every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians, yet God's people, we see David was shepherding, and there's just this constant theme of being a shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. There's the constant theme of being a shepherd, and yet we see God's people, like the children of Israel, children of Jacob, they are shepherds. It's quite interesting that they are shepherds. And on the same hand, it's quite interesting that shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptian, and yet we see something about shepherding being something that God is using. He's often calling the shepherds. He calls David. But my lesson is actually on this verse is to point out the separation that took place. To say that it's as if though they came to Egypt, they were to be separated from Egypt. They got their own special dwelling land. You may dwell in the land of Goshen. So even though there might be a need for you to go about and do stuff in the world, in the world, because we can't stay in church the whole day. We still need to go into the world and work and do all sorts of things. But yet, we're not to be of the world. So there was a sense, it appears to me, of separation. There was a sense where they are being separated out. And I like to observe this separation that takes place. And there's an encouragement or a lesson for us to also be separated from the world, even though we are in the world. So they were in Egypt, but they had a sense of separation. And it's as if Joseph is strategically planning that this separation should take place. All right, let's move now to chapter 47. So, chapter 47, as we saw, we see Joseph finally speaks to Pharaoh. He tells him about that his father and brothers are here, and they finally get into the land of Goshen. We see an exchange of conversation between Pharaoh and Israel or Jacob, where they speak of how many years he says he's been 130 years old, but how his journey has been a little bit of challenge. I've mentioned that in my introduction. So I did not highlight a lot of verses. So the one verse I've highlighted is verse 19, which says, why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh, and give us seed that we may live and not die, and that we may not be desolate. So it's part of a longer passage, as we've read, but I'm trying to highlight here a type and source of slavery based on the very olden days, the biblical days, the Old Testament days. That in the Old Testament days, there was a type of slavery that had to do with people optionally choosing to say that, please buy me, for I have nothing. They tried initially to bargain by selling their livestock, by selling their horses, but it was not enough. So should Joseph had given them for free? Maybe. But what we do see is the true source of how some of this slavery took place. It's when someone who had nothing decides to come to someone with something and say, please buy me. Please let me be yours, right? And we are seeing how it was in this way that Egypt belonged to Pharaoh. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt, for all the Egyptians sold their fields. So there was a sense that through this process, the land ownership went to Pharaoh. It's quite interesting that Joseph is not even an Egyptian, but he's doing so well in terms of enriching Pharaoh. But what we can definitely see is that this was not an abusive system. It was a system based on, it was almost like economics, right? It's a sense that here's a person who's saying that I have nothing, please let me be yours, please let me belong to you. But I think that there's also a spiritual lesson here, wherein we can also realize that we have nothing. And now the problem is when you think you have something. Blessed are the poor in spirit, right? So when you think you have something, you won't have a need to say to the Lord, buy me, let me be your servant. But when you realize that you have nothing, that even the little that you have, it's nothing and it means nothing, you can come to the Lord Jesus and say, let me be yours, let me be your servant. Now I'm remembering also the prodigal son, who made up his mind that it's better for him to return home and go to his father and say, let me just be a servant here. So it's a similar concept, that he wants to be a slave or a servant at his father's house. But we know in the prodigal son story that he was embraced as a son. But what I'm trying to show us here is both the historical context of how some of this slavery or being a servant worked out. This is one of few ways. There are other ways as well. For example, after war has taken place. But in this case, it has nothing to do with race. It has nothing to do with someone just being chased and stolen. It has everything to do with someone who's by themselves opting to become a servant to someone else because they do not have something to feed themselves with. And I think that spiritually, this is so much applicable to us, that when we realize that we have nothing, that our works cannot save us, that nothing that we have is good enough, then we say we're left with no other option but to come to the Lord and say, we want to belong to you. We do not want to be on the outside. We want to be on the inside. Now, the last verse that I've highlighted in chapter 47 is where in verse 29, let me read 29 to 30. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if now I found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh. I remember Abraham did the same, so it seems like it was a trend in those days. It doesn't mean that we should do it. That's how they did their oaths, right? So it was part of their cultural context of how they made their oaths. It doesn't mean that we should do the same. But Abraham did ask his servant to put the hand under his thigh when he was asking his servant to go find a wife for Isaac, if you remember that story. But the promise here says, do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. Now, not part of my lesson, but it's quite interesting to observe that for some of us in the African culture, we also want to be buried in the land of our own fathers, which is quite interesting to observe. I often joke about this to say that it seems like we borrowed quite a lot from the biblical narratives, making us quite close to these things. So that's just an interesting observation. But the lesson that I really want to point to is the lesson of faith, which is mentioned, like this verse is actually mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, the chapter of faith, because here the faith is that Jacob believed that it would be possible for his people to get back to the land. Why would he say that, don't bury me in Egypt? I mean, why is he asking to be buried in a land where his own people they're not even there? They're now here in Egypt. He does not even have the full ownership of the land of Canaan. So it was so much faith that he believed that it would be possible for his people to go back to the land that is to be carried out. And it's the same thing we're going to see with Joseph, because Joseph's bones were actually carried out and buried back in the land as well. So it's just an incredible faith that he believed the word of God. Remember that what God said in the previous chapter where we read, he said that go to Egypt and I'll be with you as you go to Egypt, but I'll bring you back again. And this is a faith, the faith that God will bring him back again. And it's interesting that he's coming back dead, but it's just an amazing observation of faith that he believed that his people will indeed take possession of this land. It means that he believed in the covenant that God had with him, which he carried through from Abraham to Isaac and now to Jacob, to say that this land of Canaan will be a land given to them. So that's just an amazing observation of faith, which is mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, to say that Jacob believed God, that this land will be their land, which is why it's like, don't even bury me here in Egypt. Bury me in the land of my fathers. Why? Because this land of my fathers is the land promised to me by God. So that is the lesson we have for day 16. God bless you.